Hi everyone, it's James here. Welcome to another video. This is going to be another discussion and profile of a band artist that I'm a fan of, and that is the great London post-punk band Wire. This is a group that gets a fair bit of attention, but perhaps not as much as they should. I'm just going to give you a quick history of my appreciation of this group. I'm going to show you what I've got in my collection. Yeah, so Wire, they were a really influential band. They came up in London in the 1970s. They were involved in the punk scene in London, but they weren't really punks as such. They didn't associate with the punk scene. They didn't hang around with all the other punk bands. I think they were seen as being outsiders, really. They recorded this hugely influential album, Pink Flag, which contains a great number of very short, abrupt, spiky, grainy, jerky sounding songs with tremendous sense of discipline and structure. What made Wire different from a lot of the punk bands that were around is that they didn't embrace chaos or noise in the way that the punk bands did. Everything was very pared down, very structured. They were really interested in trying to make songs that had a really stripped down, disciplined approach. And I think because of that they went on to influence lots of post-punk music, bands such as 9 Inch Nails, and any band that had a very intense but highly structured approach to music. Wire were masters of that game, really. And Pink Flag, if you haven't heard Pink Flag, it's worth hearing. It can be a bit of a shock to the system at first. It has classic early punk written all over it in a sense, so you get that very fast guitar attack. But like I said, their music, it doesn't really fit easily into the messiness and the anarchy of punk. It's much more disciplined than that, and they quite quickly ditched this sound and they went on to explore. Well, I say explore, but in a way they kind of went on to define post-punk in a way, you know, that kind of the sound that came up after punk, because the most imaginative punk bands were the ones who quickly realised that it wasn't going to be that there wasn't going to be much longevity in the idea of just wheeling out the same old pseudo Sex Pistols kind of sound. So they went on to explore. Well, I mean, they went through lots of different phases in their career. Initially they went into a more kind of doomy direction, almost industrial, and later on they became much more melodic, and they had an 80s incarnation and then a 90s incarnation. Just to give you a bit of background to my involvement with them, I shared a house years and years ago with a guy who was really into Wire, and I used to hear their music coming out of his bedroom. His room was at the bottom of the stairs. I used to go up to get to my room, and I would hear this very kind of, not angry, but very belligerent sounding, quite kind of shouty music coming from his room with these very, very intense, sharp guitars, you know, kind of, I think the word intense is the best word that I'm going to come up with, and it didn't sort of chime with me immediately. I thought, God, who are those shouty idiots in there? And but then my friend was determined, I think, or he wanted to get me into Wire, so he made me a compilation. I think it was a compilation CD, and it contained a lot of music that Wire did later on in the 80s, and it was a really different kind of thing. It was much more melodic. It was kind of dream pop. It still had a bit of industrial stuff going on, but it was much more melodic. I mean, all the members of the band came from different musical worlds in a way. You had Colin, who was really into the Beatles. He was an ex-art school person, so he had that kind of classic rock art school approach. You know, think of Pete Townsend, think of John Lennon. He had the melody. He had just that love of angular left field pop music. You had Graham Lewis on bass, who had actually studied textiles and fashion, and he was really into Motown, and one of his favourite bands was Free. And Bruce Gilbert, the guitarist, he was really heavily into the blues. You know, people such as John Lee Hooker, and you know, the guitar sounds that he went on to produce in Wire were often rooted in quite kind of primitive sonorities, and he had a very stripped back approach to the guitar. You know, no frills, nothing flouncy, no solos, just very kind of hard, stripped to the bone guitar playing, which I think came from his blues influence. And then he had the splendidly named drummer Robert Gotobed, and that actually was his real name. It was quite funny back in the day, all these punks you know, came up with different joke names for themselves. You had obviously, you know, Johnny Rotten and Sid Vicious, but Robert Gotobed, that was actually his real name. He'd been really into Cream and Ginger Baker, but his drum style is nothing like Ginger Baker. He's a bit like Bruce Gilbert. Gotobed's drumming is some of the most stripped back you're ever going to hear. You know, very, very, it's almost like a drum machine. He just plays very, very straight beats. There's not a great deal of what you might call feel there. He's quite rigid and fairly monotonous, but the kind of drumming he does fits in really well with the group. And I think that's one of the things that Wire excelled at, was that their sound was incredibly cohesive. I think they all had the exact same idea about music. They wanted to, I think it was Bruce Gilbert who said he wanted Wire's music to be like a living sculpture. I think he saw it more as a kind of art project, and he wasn't interested in any of the cliches that came either with rock performance or with rock composition. And from a performance point of view, Wire didn't indulge in any of the kind of usual rock star posturing. They didn't have fancy lights or anything. They had a very kind of stark lighting on them, you know, a bit like, I think they were quite influenced by David Bowie from the Station to Station era. And their live performance, it was theatrical, but not in the usual kind of rock star way. There was no messing about. It was just very functional, and that really fed into their music. Everything about them was very functional. You know, even the name evokes something which is very stripped back and functional. You know, there's nothing special about Wire. It just provides a conduit, you know, from A to B in a circuit. And I think that's how they saw themselves. They kind of saw themselves in this very functional light. So anyway, after Pink Flag, like I said, they then started very quickly to move on from this short, hard, sharp punk kind of sound. On the second album, Chairs Missing, they started to dabble with more, I'd say probably experimental pop. The great earworm song on this record is I Am the Fly, which was a flop single. I am the fly, I am the fly, I am the fly, I am the fly, fly the ointments. I am the fly, I am the fly, I am the... Virtually all the stuff that Wire put out was not commercially successful. It was massively influential later on, but it never really sold in any great quantities. Outdoor Miner from this record as well has a lovely melodic quality to it, I think courtesy of Colin Newman. Another liner of leaf structure, the egg timer. Left on the side, is he trying to hide? In fact, it's the earth which is nonsense, but... Yeah, that's Chairs Missing, the second album. And then for the third album, 154, they went off into more kind of doomy territory. There's a real doomy industrial quality to this record. I Should Have Known Better, Two People in a Room. There's a kind of audible atmosphere of menace that starts to creep through, which I think, again, it made them quite influential later on in post-punk. You can sort of bracket them with Magazine, Howard DeVito, that kind of cold, dark, quite kind of uninviting kind of sound. So that was a very strong album as well. But then after this, they actually took a long break, and Wire's career was characterised by a kind of stop-start thing. It was a bit like King Crimson. Strangely enough, you know, even though Wire came up in the punk era, I think they were quite influenced by the more the more credible side of prog rock. You know, think of King Crimson, think of Van de Graaff Generator. They were not that keen on just churning out stuff all the time. They would go into a hiatus period. They would have a rethink, regroup, and come back. And they came back in the 80s and made a series of really brilliant albums, I think. First there was The Ideal Copy, and this has definitely a more electronic sound. B.C. Gilbert was really, I think, starting to use a lot of very interesting effects pedals, and there were keyboards creeping in and samples, but it was not a derivative sound. You know, it's not a sound which is hampered by any of the dodgy stuff that was going on in the 80s. You know, production-wise, they managed to retain their own identity very strongly. They then made this album, which is possibly my favourite Wire album. This is A Bell is a Cup Until It's Struck, which just contains some brilliant stuff. Follow the Locust, which is this great kind of long, epic, atmospheric song with all sorts of brilliant overlapping guitar parts. Also the song Kidney Bingos, which is possibly one of the most kind of gorgeous dream pop songs. It has this wonderful chiming guitar from B.C. Gilbert and very stream of consciousness lyrics. Wire's lyrics were always very interesting. I think what they used to do was they used to write them down as poems or as pieces of text, and then they would pass them between each other and then set each other's lyrics to music. So the songwriting, it wasn't organic in a way that songwriting often is in bands. You know, Graham Lewis would write some text, he would always call it text, and he would pass it to Colin Newman, and Colin would make a song out of it, and then Colin would give Graham some text as well, and Graham would do the same. Really interesting approach. They then made an album called It's Beginning to and Back Again, which contains its kind of live in the studio versions of songs from the previous two albums. This contains a brilliant 12-inch version of their song Eardrum Buzz, which is one of the most commercial things they ever did. It's a really great left field commercial kind of song, and you know, maybe shades of XTC creeping in, and just a great hook, a great earworm song. And it's quite interesting because I think Wire's music was always quite earwormy. Even if you go back to Pink Flag, where the songs have this very punky and very austere kind of atmosphere, they were always good at coming up with hooks. And Buzz Buzz Buzz, Eardrum Buzz, if you haven't heard that, I'd say start with that really, because it's one of Wire's most accessible songs. I should just say that I've not been bowled over by everything Wire have done. For me, Wire have some really great songs in their catalogue and some really great albums and, you know, moments of true inspiration, but there's other patches of their work I find more difficult. This is an example. This is another album that they made in the 80s. This is Manscape, and to me this kind of misses what's good about 80s Wire. It's rather lacking in hooks and inspiration. You know, for me personally, I don't think this album is quite on a par with the others. It's getting a bit more pure electronic. You know, drum machines are starting to creep in. Richard Gotobed, the drummer, he actually left the band after this record because he felt that the group had moved too far into using drum machines, and it kind of wasn't really floating his boat anymore. And then after Manscape in 1991, the band released an album called The Drill, which was officially listed as an EP. And it basically contains lots of different remixes of the same song, Drill. And then a bit later in 1991 they came up with an album called The First Letter, and by this time Robert Gotobed had left the band, the drummer, because he thought that the group had gone off in too much of an electronic direction, you know, with drum machines. and it was quite funny because he'd left the band, they called themselves Wire, but they called themselves Wire without the E, acknowledging the fact that they'd lost a key member. Not a particularly great album that either, I don't think. It's okay, but I wouldn't particularly start with that. Not a very melodic record really. And then there was in 2002, so there was another couple of years gap, they then came back with an EP, that's Read and Burn, that contains 4 tracks. Then in 2003 there was an album called Send, which I don't actually have. And then there was a fairly sizable pause again in operations, and the band came back finally in 2008 with the album Object 47. By this time BC Gilbert had actually left the band. He decided that he didn't really want to go back to doing Wire anymore. I think in his mind, you know, Wire was always, it was a kind of artistic statement. It was something more than just another rock and roll band. And this album actually saw Colin Newman and Graham Lewis really taking artistic control of the band and deciding just to be a band, I think. I mean, they've worked really solidly ever since this record came out. They've maintained a very solid schedule of releases. This album was called Object 47 because it was the 47th item in the Pink Flag record label. They formed their own label called Pink Flag, and this was the 47th release on the label. But it's still a pretty good record. It's fairly heavy, it's fairly grainy, but it's got a good strong sense of melody to it. Colin Newman was always the band's strongest melody writer, and that really comes through on this record. And in 2011 they made another very strong album called Red Bark Tree, which has some really quite heavy stuff on it. There's some very aggressive sounding guitars and some very almost kind of scary sounding songs on this.
Yesterday, just beyond the motorway, saw us looking away through the flame of far away.
It's got some really kind of dark moments, but also some moments of real crystal clear melody and some really beautiful kind of dream pop tunes on it. I think they've been able to draw on the stuff that they did in the 80s when they became more melodic, and they've managed to weld that to perhaps the more guitar-y post-punk kind of sound which they had in the late 70s to great effect really. Then they made an album called Change Becomes Us, and again this one it's got some really good things on it. It's probably again a bit more melodic again, heading into more melodic territory. And this record actually draws upon song ideas that have been kicking around since 1979 and 1980. They were originally just quick sketches for live performances, and then years later they decided to revisit them and turn them into a studio album. Then in 2015 they made a self-titled album just called Wire, and that pulled together some stuff which they'd been working on live, I think the previous couple of years. This is the record Nocturnal Koreans, which came out a few years ago, which I decided to buy on vinyl, and that's a pretty good record. And this actually brings us up to date as far as the collection is concerned. There is one other album that they've made in more recent times. In 2017 they made an album called Silver Lead, and that was conceived to arrive in conjunction with the 40th anniversary of Wire's first gig, which had been at the Roxy on the 1st of April 1977, so perhaps they kind of see it as coming full circle in some way. So like I said, yeah, I mean, Wire I think are a really historically important band. I think they went on to influence so many different artists, and their sound originally was, I think, was quite ahead of its time. It drew on the stuff that was around at the time in the 1970s. It drew on things like the Ramones, and they tried to do something. I think they tried to elevate or use punk rock as the catalyst for something more artistically adventurous. And ever since then, like I said, they've gone on to explore so many different angles and so many different avenues, and they've reinvented themselves in a way which I think it kind of places them in that grand tradition of bands like the Beatles and Pink Floyd. I think they've got more in common with art rock in a way than they have with the punks. And I saw them live a few years ago, and it was a really amazing gig. I saw them in a very small venue. I think it was in one of the small venues at Manchester Academy. And they came on, and they just looked like very normal middle-aged guys, you know. And Colin Newman had all these effects pedals laid out on the floor, and they started to play, and they played stuff from all the way through their career, and it was very, very intense. Really, really loud. I'm not a big, huge fan of hardcore music, but I do appreciate a lot of that stuff. And when you see Wire live, you can definitely hear how they've influenced bands such as Helmet. You know, bands that have that very, very uncompromising, just that kind of wall of noise and sound. But what's great about Wire is that it's really controlled. Nothing is left to chance in their sound. It's very architectured, and I suppose that is probably because of their art school training and the fact that they had a sculptor in the band, and you know, people who kind of really understood how to put a song together and to think in terms of structure rather than in terms of you know, any kind of rock and roll looseness or funkiness. You know, why we're not a funky or a loose band. It was a totally different thing, quite austere. If you haven't checked out Wire, I would say go for, if you like melody, have a listen to A Bell Is a Cup Until It's Struck, because, yeah, like I said, that has a lot of very pretty sounding melodies, but it still contains enough edgy left field stuff for it to be recognisably Wire. But if you want to go back to the source and kind of absolutely hear what it was that originally made them so distinctive, then you can't really go wrong. Check out Pink Flag, one of the most important albums that was ever recorded, I think, and you know, massively influential. Okay folks, hope you enjoyed that. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye bye.